There is a question that computer scientists have been dodging for decades, not because it is difficult to ask, but because the answer, if correct, dismantles one of the most ambitious projects in human history. The question is this: can a machine, in principle, do everything your mind does? The intuitive answer is yes. The brain processes information. Computers process information. Therefore, given enough time and computing power, a machine could replicate any mental process. This is the strong argument of artificial intelligence. It is elegant. It is comfortable. And there is a mathematical proof published in 1931 that suggests it is fundamentally wrong. It is not a philosophical opinion. It is not a spiritual intuition. It is a formal proof, pure logic. And what this proof implies about your mind is something that academia has not quite digested, even 90 years later. Start here. In 1931, a 25-year-old Austrian mathematician named Kurt Gödel published a paper that shook the foundations of mathematics. What Gödel proved, with a precision that no one could refute, is that any sufficiently powerful formal system, any set of rules and axioms capable of doing basic arithmetic, contains statements that are true, but that the same system cannot prove. Pause on that. A system that follows perfect rules, that makes no mistakes, that operates with absolute rigor. And yet, there are truths that this system can see but cannot prove from within itself, not because it lacks data, but because there is a structural geometric limit inherent to the very concept of a formal system. Gödel built his proof in a way that is still baffling today. He found a way to make a mathematical system make a statement about itself. He took a proposition that, translated into ordinary language, says something like this: this statement cannot be proved within this system. If the system can prove it, then the statement is false, and the system just proved something false, which makes it inconsistent. If the system cannot prove it, then the statement is true, and the system is incomplete because there is a truth it cannot reach. There is no way out. The system is trapped by its own structure. This is not a semantic trick. It is the most profound proof ever made about the limits of algorithmic reasoning. The result shocked the mathematicians of his time because, just a few years earlier, David Hilbert had proposed the most ambitious program in the history of mathematics: to formalize all mathematics into a complete and consistent system, a set of axioms from which any mathematical truth could be derived mechanically. Gödel proved, with the same surgical elegance of someone dismantling a clockwork mechanism, that this program was impossible. Not difficult. Impossible. And this is where physics enters the picture, because what Gödel proved about formal systems is, in a very precise sense, what Roger Penrose argued applies directly to the brain, the mind, to consciousness. But before getting there, it is necessary to understand what a machine has to do with a mathematical system. The answer lies with a figure that almost no one knows outside computer science departments, but who define the era in which we live. In 1936, Alan Turing, the English mathematician who would later build the theoretical foundation of all modern computing, described an imaginary device that he called a Turing machine. It was abstract, conceptual. It had no buttons or screen, but it captured the essence of what it means to compute, read symbols, apply rules, write results, repeat. Turing proved that any process that can be described as a sequence of defined and finite steps can be executed by one of these machines. Any process, without exception. The main point is this: any computer that exists today, from the chip in your phone to the most powerful servers in the world, is essentially a Turing machine. It executes instructions. It follows rules. It operates on symbols. And if the human brain is also deep down a system that follows rules, then it is also, in principle, a Turing machine. And if it is a Turing machine, it is subject exactly to the limits that Gödel proved. This is where Penrose makes his move, and it is a move that few have dared to refute with precision. If the brain were completely algorithmic, if all mental activity were the result of following formal rules, then our capacity for mathematical reasoning would be limited, exactly as Gödel described. There would be truths that we could intuit, but that our own mental system could not prove from within. The problem is that mathematicians in practice do not work like that. When Gödel built his proof, he used something that no algorithm has by definition. He could see from outside the system. He could recognize the truth of his proposition precisely because he was not trapped inside the formal rules he analyzed. That leap, that ability to adopt a perspective that is outside the system being studied, is not an operation that any algorithm can execute on itself. Penrose calls this mathematical insight, the ability to recognize truths that go beyond any finite set of rules. And he argues with considerable rigor that this cannot be the result of an algorithmic process, because an algorithmic process, by definition, cannot step outside the system that defines it. This is not mysticism. It is the direct consequence of Gödel's theorem applied to the nature of the mind. If I can recognize truths that no algorithm can prove, then my thought process is not completely algorithmic. And if it is not completely algorithmic, then it cannot be replicated by any Turing machine, no matter how powerful. Most cognitive scientists respond to this argument in two ways. The first is to ignore it. The second is to say that the mathematical insight of humans is also fallible, that mathematicians make mistakes, that intuition can deceive. Penrose knows this, but the question is not whether humans are infallible. The question is whether there is something in the process of recognizing mathematical truths that is irreducibly non-algorithmic. And that is a different question, and much harder to dodge. It was looking for answers to this that I found this digital book. The Penrose Dossier, What Academia Fears to Admit, is neither a biography nor a physics manual. It is something more precise and, in a way, more uncomfortable. It is a map of the mental posture that makes it possible to get to the bottom of a question that hurts. The posture of someone who does not accept that it works is a sufficient answer when the real question is, why does it work? Penrose spent decades asking questions that his colleagues preferred to dodge, not because they were impossible, but because the answers were disturbing. This book documents exactly this disposition, the ability to sustain intellectual discomfort without resolving it prematurely, to stay with the open question until the real answer emerges, and to distinguish between knowledge that makes you feel smart and knowledge that changes you. You are in that state right now. The mind still processing, the old model still crumbling. There is a specific brief window between the moment an idea disturbs you and the moment you file it as interesting and move on. It is in that window that real learning occurs, not later. Now. The link is in the first pinned comment, but beware. This content may be taken down. Click now. Download your copy. What is the mathematical or logical truth that you recognize as true, but that you could not formally prove within a system of fixed rules? Leave your answer in the comments. But Penrose's argument does not stop at Gödel. Penrose knows perfectly well that most of his colleagues could live with the conclusion that the mind is not a classical algorithm, as long as they can propose an alternative mechanism within known physics. And this is where his proposal becomes truly radical. If consciousness is not algorithmic, what is it then? Penrose's answer involves quantum mechanics, not as a metaphor, as a real mechanism. Quantum mechanics is the most accurate theory physics has ever produced. It describes the behavior of subatomic particles with an exactness that is unparalleled in any other area of science. And there is something in quantum mechanics that is profoundly disconcerting when thought about honestly: superposition. Before being measured, a quantum particle has no defined state. It is not that we don't know what its state is. It is that in a physically precise sense, it has none. It exists in a superposition of multiple possible states simultaneously. When a measurement is made, the wave function collapses and the particle adopts a defined state. But during the time it remains unobserved, it exists in all its possible states at once. This is not philosophy. It is the result of experiments reproduced thousands of times, from the double-slit experiment with electrons to interferometries with increasingly complex molecules. Quantum superposition is an experimental fact, not a speculation, and Penrose argues that it is precisely there, in the collapse of the wave function, where the mechanism of consciousness might reside. His reasoning is as follows. If consciousness is non-algorithmic, it needs a physical mechanism that is also not algorithmic. Quantum mechanics offers exactly that. The collapse of the wave function in the standard interpretation is a genuinely non-deterministic process. There is no rule that tells you exactly when it will occur or why it occurs one way and not another. It is, in a precise sense, the only process in physics that cannot be perfectly simulated by any classical algorithm. His proposal, developed together with the anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff from the University of Arizona, is called orchestrated objective reduction, abbreviated as orch-or. The idea is that within neurons, there are protein structures called microtubules, components of the cellular cytoskeleton that have dimensions on the order of nanometers, small enough for quantum effects to be potentially relevant. According to this hypothesis, microtubules would process information in quantum superposition, and the orchestrated collapse of that superposition would generate discrete moments of consciousness. Not a continuous stream of experience, but a series of quantum events that collectively produce what we experience as consciousness. The proposal is controversial. Many physicists and neuroscientists reject it, and their objections are serious. The most common argument is that the brain is too warm and too noisy to maintain quantum coherence long enough to be relevant. Decoherence, the process by which quantum systems lose their superposition by interacting with the environment, occurs in biological systems at body temperature on extraordinarily short timescales, on the order of femtoseconds to picoseconds, orders of magnitude faster than the neural processes relevant to cognition. Penrose knows this objection better than anyone. His response is that the mechanism of orch-or is qualitatively different from the ordinary quantum coherence sought in quantum computing experiments. That the collapse he proposes is related to a deeper phenomenon, a quantum correction of gravity that is not yet formalized in any complete theory, but that both general relativity and quantum mechanics, in their most radical versions, point out as necessary. Penrose argues that at the Planck scale, where the geometry of spacetime ceases to be classical, there is a form of objective selection among quantum alternatives that does not require an external observer, and that is, by nature, non-computable. The link is in the first pinned comment. The last units are running out. Click now and start your journey towards the clarity and genius you deserve. Consider what this means in concrete terms. If Penrose is right, then there is a physical process occurring in your brain right now that no simulation can replicate. Not because the simulation is slow or inaccurate, but because that process is fundamentally non-computable. There is no algorithm, however powerful, that can produce exactly the same result given exactly the same initial state. It is, in Penrose's vocabulary, an operation that goes beyond computability in the Turing sense, and there is something that most debates on artificial intelligence dodge with elegant unawareness. An artificial intelligence system can learn to play chess better than any human. It can learn to recognize patterns in medical images with an accuracy that surpasses specialists. It can generate text that sounds indistinguishable from that produced by a human. All of this is genuinely remarkable and has real value. But if you ask that system if there are mathematical truths it cannot reach, the answer is yes, by definition of a formal system. Gödel's theorem applies. There are true propositions within any sufficiently rich formal system that this system cannot prove from within. And the crucial difference is that the system cannot recognize it, because recognizing it requires exactly the kind of stepping outside the system that Penrose describes as the hallmark of the mind. There is a story that Penrose tells in his lectures. He tells it with the deliberate precision that characterizes everything he does. He speaks of Turing, for whom he had enormous intellectual respect, and of the question that obsessed Turing his entire life. Can a machine think? Turing proposed an operational criterion to answer that question, known as the Turing test. If a machine can hold a conversation indistinguishably from a human, then for all practical purposes it thinks. With today's language systems, that superficial criterion seems increasingly close to being surpassed. But Penrose argues that the Turing test asks exactly the wrong question, because imitating the external behavior of a mind is not the same as having a mind. An actor can imitate pain convincingly. That doesn't mean he feels pain. A machine can generate text that sounds reflective. That doesn't mean it reflects. The relevant question is not whether machines can appear conscious. The question is whether there is something that happens to a system when it processes information that cannot be reduced to symbol manipulation. Something that physics has not yet formally captured. Something that Gödel's theorem points out as structurally distinct from any algorithmic process, and the answer that Penrose defends with the patience of someone who knows he is talking about something that will take decades or centuries to fully digest is yes, that there is such a thing, that this something is consciousness. And that understanding, it requires a physics that does not yet exist, but that is, in his opinion, inevitable. The link is in the first pinned comment. The last units are running out. Click now and start your journey towards the clarity and genius you deserve. Having reached this point, I need to speak directly to you, because there is a reason why this argument produces a specific discomfort in anyone who listens to it carefully. We live in a time when the dominant narrative about the mind is a computational narrative. The brain processes information. Thoughts are patterns of neural activation. Identity is the software running on the biological hardware. This narrative has an implicit consequence that few people formulate honestly. If the brain is an algorithm, then there is nothing in you that cannot, in principle, be replicated, transferred, or replaced. Your subjective experience, your sense of being you, would be the product of a particular configuration of rules and data, modifiable, reproducible, replaceable. If Penrose is right, if consciousness involves something that goes beyond any algorithmic process, if there is a physical mechanism at the base of your experience that is irreducibly non-computable, then that narrative is wrong, not in the details, in the fundamentals. When was the last time you made a decision that you cannot fully explain in terms of identifiable causes and effects? not what the subsequent reasoning constructed as a justification, the decision itself. The moment something resolved in you before the words arrived. Penrose does not argue that this moment is supernatural. He argues that it could be the trace of a physical process that we do not yet understand. A process that operates on a scale where gravity and quantum mechanics meet at the Planck scale, where space-time has a structure that no current theory fully describes. That is where the real frontier of physics lives, not in particle accelerations that confirm known predictions. In the question of what exactly happens when the wave function collapses, and whether that collapse, in some precise sense that we cannot yet formalize, has any relationship with what it means to be conscious. Gödel's argument does not prove that consciousness is mystical. It proves that there is a class of process that algorithms cannot execute, the recognition of truths that transcend the system that generates them. And if the mind does that, something mathematicians effectively do when proving theorems that point out the limits of formal systems themselves, then the mind is not completely algorithmic. No more than the universe is completely Newtonian. Physics does not end where human intuition feels comfortable. It has always begun exactly where the discomfort starts. Newton pulled us out of Aristotelian motion. Einstein pulled us out of absolute space. Gödel pulled us out of mathematical certainty. Penrose proposes that there is a next step, a step in which consciousness itself ceases to be the external observer of the universe and becomes part of the problem that physics must solve. There is a distinction that few make when talking about artificial intelligence and consciousness, and it is a distinction that Penrose considers fundamental: the difference between simulation and realization. A computer can perfectly simulate the behavior of a hydrogen atom without there being any hydrogen atom inside it. It can simulate the behavior of water without being wet. It can simulate gravity without being attracted to any center of mass. The simulation reproduces the external behavior without instantiating the real process. The question Penrose raises is, can a computer simulate consciousness without being conscious? And if it can, would that simulation be something morally relevant, something that experiences, or would it just be a perfect mirror with nothing behind it? This question has no answer within current physics, but Gödel's theorem at least tells us that if consciousness involves non-computable processes, then simulation and realization are not the same thing. It wouldn't just be that the machine doesn't feel. It would be that it cannot, in principle, do what the mind does when it recognizes its own incompleteness. And this in a world that builds increasingly sophisticated language systems and discusses with growing seriousness whether these systems are or could become conscious is not a theoretical question. It is the most practical question there is. There is something I find genuinely remarkable at this point. Not the conclusion, which remains open and disputed, but the kind of intellectual honesty it takes to stay in this unresolved territory. Penrose could have built a comfortable career in relativistic geometry, a field in which his contributions, particularly his work on singularities together with Stephen Hawking in the 1960s and 70s, are undisputed and fundamental. Instead, he chose to spend decades defending a thesis that most of his peers consider wrong or at least premature. He didn't do it because he is stubborn. He did it because Gödel showed him something he couldn't unsee. Once you see that formal systems have structural limits that no increase in power can overcome, and that mathematicians routinely operate beyond those limits, the question of what mechanism makes that possible becomes inevitable. Inevitable like entropy, like the curvature of space-time, like the incompleteness theorem from which we started. So stay with this image. There is a mathematical proposition sitting at the heart of formal logic that says, I am true, but I cannot be proved from here. And you can see it. You can recognize its truth from where you stand, from outside the system that trapped it. That moment of recognition, that instant when the mind leaps beyond the system of rules that described it, is what Roger Penrose has spent decades pointing out as the most important thing we still don't know how to explain. Not as a defect of science, as its most alive, most honest, and, in a sense, most beautiful frontier. The universe generated systems capable of seeing their own limitations, capable of constructing propositions that transcend the system that constructs them, capable of recognizing truths that no algorithm can reach from the inside. If this seems simply remarkable to you, you are paying attention. If it seems disturbing, you are paying much more attention. And if you feel that this changes something in the way you think about your own mind, about what you are and what cannot be replicated, then you have arrived at exactly the same place where Gödel took Penrose decades ago. There is no map for what comes next, only the question, and the honesty not to answer it prematurely.